Hello, welcome to the third lecture in my course on English literature before the Renaissance. Today I'm going to talk to you about Beowulf, the greatest piece of literature from the earliest era in English history and literature. We're entering a world that is very different from ours, where dragons roam the land, full of heroism and treason, revenge, wars between tribes, a world on the brink of destruction, but in which there is much beauty, so perhaps a world not that different from ours. But first, let me tell you what we're going to cover in this lecture, in order for you to understand this poem and enjoy it. I want to give you a quick run through the main issues that scholars and students reading it for the past hundreds of years have come up against and that perhaps you have also wondered about. Because Beowulf requires a bit of work to understand, because the society and culture it describes are very different from our own today. In the following, I want to give you this necessary cultural background for the world of the poem. First, I'll tell you why we're still reading this poem. Then I'll try to give you a bit of background for what was going on in Europe at the time. Then we'll go through the main events that happen in the poem. Then we'll talk about setting, the time and place in which the action happens. Then we'll have a look at who might have composed this poem and who might have been interested in reading or listening to it, so the poem's audience. Then I'll tell you a few things about the heroic culture of the characters of Beowulf, and then we'll discuss the different systems of morality that clash and combine in the poem, why this is a Christian poem and why this is important and why the characters in it are pagan and what that means and what the implications are for how we can understand the poem's message. Finally, I'll talk about the mixture of fantastical and mythical and historical elements in the poem and how all of them work together to give the reader a unique experience. So, first of all, why do we still study Beowulf, this 1500-year-old poem? Because it is great poetry and one of the world's greatest stories, up there with great epic poems like the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as all great art, it enables us to think through some very deep and some very old and still relevant and always relevant human questions. For example, how we can learn to balance the ordered, rational part of us with our dark, chaotic side, how we can deal with great social and political change in our world, what makes someone heroic and worthy of praise, and how this praise sometimes makes us forget about the darkness that still exists within them. So, these are some of the very broad themes that you can find in Beowulf and really throughout human art and culture and things that really we all have to deal with personally in our lives at some point or another. And Beowulf is also important because the story of English literature starts with it. It's the first chapter in the book, so to say. So everything written since then is rooted in Beowulf in some form or another. Also, it contains what is most characteristic and most interesting about the Anglo Saxon period, about the earliest period of English history and literature. And in it, we can see some of the trends and some of the main themes that become central in English culture and history and literature, from its subtle humor, the so called British humor, that we can see in this poem. For instance, the poet tells us that the monster Grendel was not very happy at all that day, which is a very roundabout way of saying, and pretty ironic way of saying that he was very angry because he was defeated and killed by our main hero. So, from that to what means to be English and what it means to be European, which is something that is very much in debate even up to this day, if you look at what goes on in the United Kingdom. Now, If you've seen or read The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, perhaps, uh, that's the kind of world that Beowulf looks like. And actually, those works were directly inspired by Beowulf because Tolkien, the author of both books, was a great scholar of medieval English literature, and Beowulf in particular. For example, in The Hobbit, remember the scene where Bilbo sneaks up on the dragon and the dragon is sleeping on a pile of gold? Well, that's taken directly from Beowulf, from the end of Beowulf, when our hero ends up meeting the dragon face to face. And but generally, the the atmosphere, the whole world of these poems, although fantastical imaginary, is inspired by early medieval Europe, as it is reflected in Beowulf. Now, this is a period that comes after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and long before the Renaissance, 1000 years before the Renaissance. And it's a pretty wild and dangerous world. There are many tribes fighting amongst themselves all over Europe. And a bit later, the Vikings come on the scene. And you may have heard about the Vikings. They were mainly warriors living in what is nowadays Scandinavia, Northern Europe, so Denmark, Sweden, Norway, who embark on their ships and sail to different places and raid. They attack cities and plunder all the valuables they can find. And all Europe lives and trembles in fear of these people. And the world in the poem Beowulf has much in common with Viking culture. They're both heroic cultures, heroic societies, meaning that they value things like manliness, bravery, and they think whatever they can plunder is fair game. If they can get away with raiding a city or an enemy tribe and stealing their belongings, then it's all fair game. And actually, whoever can win the most treasure is the most respected man among in these societies. But on the other hand, these are dangerous societies. You never know when you're going to end up killed, and you never know when an enemy tribe or maybe your personal enemy from another band of warriors comes at night and kills you or tries to kill you. And this is how the characters in the poem live like. But the action takes place a few centuries before the Vikings, although in the same area, so in Scandinavia. But all that being said, this poem is written in Old English, in the earliest form of the English language by Anglo-Saxons, so the ancestors of the English people today. So it is an early English poem about people whom these early English people, the Anglo-Saxons, considered to be their ancestors who came from over the seas. So why is that? Well, in our previous lecture, I gave you some background on the early English. We call them the Anglo-Saxons because there were at least two tribes, actually more tribes, that came to Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire, so around the 5th centuries. They came from the continent, from the area of modern-day Denmark, and they gradually became Christian in the 7th century, and that is important because it brought them into this wider European culture. And I told you about their language, which is related to other Germanic languages like German, Swedish, Norwegian, Dutch. And Beowulf is a poem that shows you what the Anglo Saxons believed their ancestors' lives looked like. So it is an imagined history in a way, although it does contain historical events. So first, let's quickly go through what happens in Beowulf. At, at the start, the king of the Danes, Hrothgar, has built a great mead hall. And the great hall is very important for heroic culture, for heroic societies, and specifically in Beowulf, because it's the center of the social life of these societies, where people sit drinking mead, which is a kind of beer, hence the term mead hall, and they tell stories, and here is where they can be around their king. And this mead hall in the poem is invaded night after night by a terrible monster called Grendel, who kills whoever he finds inside it. And a young warrior from the tribe of the Geats, named Beowulf, hears of Hrothgar's troubles and comes to his aid. He faces Grendel unarmed and tears off the monster's arm in a wild wrestling match. Everyone is happy, but not for long, because during the next night, the monster's mother comes and attacks the hall in revenge for the death of her son. Fearless, Beowulf follows her tracks to an underwater cave and, after a fight in which he almost gets killed, manages to end her life. He returns to the Danish hall to much praise, celebration, and gift giving, and soon he returns to his native land. In the last part of the poem, that happens 50 years after these first episodes, Beowulf is now himself an old king. His kingdom is attacked by a dragon who was awoken from his sleep in his underground nest um, when the pile of ancient treasures on which he sleeps is plundered one night. And this might sound a bit familiar if you've read or seen The Hobbit. Coming back to the poem, Beowulf, even though he's old and even though he knows he will probably get killed, he goes forth to fight this dragon, accompanied by a troop of men. When they get close, these men get scared and leave him alone, except one guy, Wiglaf, who comes to the king's aid. Together, they manage to kill the dragon, but Beowulf is mortally wounded. He dies beside the heap of treasure he has won for his tribe. But an enemy tribe, the Swedes, the the ancestors of the Swedes today, are said to be coming to attack the Geats. And now the Geats are without protection since their king, Beowulf, has died. And so the poem ends with our hero buried with mourning and sad ceremony, and the Geats, his tribe, having this uncertain fate awaiting them. Now, let's talk a bit about setting the time and the place of the action. Beowulf is a very mysterious piece of poetry for a number of reasons. We don't know its purpose, we don't know its authors, we don't know when it was composed. We know that the poem was written down around the year 1000 in a manuscript that almost got burned. Um, but the poem might have already existed for maybe 400 years as an oral poem, so a poem that people would recite and hand down from generation to generation purely by speech for maybe 400 years. Think about it. That's like one of Shakespeare's plays being just passed down from generation to the next, and someone in our age thinks, well, we should really write that down. So it's a really long time, and the action is set sometime in the 400s. Uh, we know this because the poem does mention some historical events that really took place, although there are many characters and beings that are obviously fictional in this poem. There are dragons and monsters alongside these more historical characters. So it's really a mix of history and myth. The action takes place in modern day Scandinavia in Northern Europe, and although it features no Anglo Saxon, as I was telling you, it was important for the early English because uh, it is a story about their ancestors. But the sense of place in this poem is very important, more than actual geography, because it appears as this threatening space where danger lurks behind the horizon, where these monsters, these border walkers, as the poem calls them, and I quote, they prowl the moors, huge marauders from some other world. And in this very dangerous, very monstrous space, the Lord's Mead Hall is an actual and symbolic refuge. Here are heat and light, here are beauty and ceremony, human solidarity and culture. The Here is where the warriors share the benches, where everyone sits around drinking mead, um, where the old veterans tell their tales of kings and heroes from the past, and where the young braves, wishing to prove themselves in battle, also sit together. So, this is where the heroic warrior culture enshrined in Beowulf lives, in the Great Hall. And this culture is based on some very simple things: the desire to gain a glorious name in the rush of battle, the pride of defending one's lord and king, and the bond between the lord and his companions, his men that serve him even into death. This is a bond sealed in song and feasting in the hall in times of peace, and in giving away treasure, the war loot, this plunder, in times of war. So these people don't have a family. Their fellow warriors are their family. And so heroic poems like the ones which inspired Beowulf celebrates these bonds between men facing danger and sometimes dying together. This is what the honor code of this culture looks like. And I quote from the poem: "It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. For every one of us living in this world means waiting for our end. Let whoever can win glory before death." So, who might have written this poem depicting this very macho, this hyper masculine culture, and in this very grim, this very dark setting? Surprisingly, although it never mentions Christian doctrine, it is most certainly the work of a Christian poet, meant for an audience that had been Christian for at least a generation or two, if not more. Why this is important? Because this was the system of moral values of European culture at this time. And also because Christianity is what brings the technology of writing and literacy and the very concept of writing down long poems to England. So, really, although the poem, um, although the people that Beowulf depicts are pagans, there are no pagans at this time in Europe. Now, what does it mean to be a pagan? Well, to worship several gods, and at least in the minds of Christians, to live your life by plundering and raiding. Though, of course, in reality, not all pagans did that. And of course, the Anglo Saxons had been pagan themselves in their history. So, which means that they had gods which they worshipped that were very similar to Norse gods like Thor and Odin before they became Marvel superheroes. Because remember, they were related to the Norse, that is, the Vikings. And these gods survive in the names for the days of the week. So, for example, Thursday is Thor's day, and Wednesday is Odin's day, the day of Odin, Woden, as the Anglo-Saxons called him. And all of this ended around the year 600 when Christian missionaries started spreading the religion, and some Anglo Saxon kings converted. And so everyone kind of had to convert to Christianity. So, why did an Anglo Saxon Christian took the effort to write this 3,000 lines long poem about a very unchristian subject: dragons, monsters, pagans, bloody killings, and revenge? All this is very unchristian. Um, there is nothing like Beowulf in Europe at that time, because other medieval peoples were very happy to be no longer pagan, and so they were uninterested in their ancestors. The past is a dark place, they thought, and they would rather forget about them leading very unchristian lives in the past. But the Anglo Saxons were not like this. The Anglo Saxons wanted to preserve a connection to their pagan past and to their ancestors who had come from over the northern sea, even though now they were Christians. So, one of the main preoccupations of the Beowulf poet is to balance this nostalgia for of the Anglo Saxons for their past and the fact that this past was filled with things they weren't proud of. So the poem responds to this cultural anxiety. How do we, as Christian English people, remember and relate to our pagan ancestors back in the day? Because the world of Beowulf is definitely pagan. People bring sacrifices to the gods, they believe in fate, and their only hope for life after death, as we have seen, is the glory of having their deeds sung in heroic songs, like Beowulf. But the poet shows us these people as noble pagans, as people worthy of being remembered with honor. We are meant to admire the hero's actions and accept that there is common ground for pagan and Christian secular values that we too ought to practice: hospitality, readiness for defense, generosity, courage, and loyalty. On the other hand, the poet cannot allow itself, the poet cannot allow himself to get too carried away by the virtues of these pagan ancestors. Their world is pagan and doomed to fall, after all, from a Christian perspective. And the brilliance of the poem especially lies in its final part, separated by 50 years from the action of the first episodes. All the values celebrated in these earlier episodes are now presented as doubtful and finally abandoned. The good things of this world and the virtues of heroism that they represent are not enough to save Beowulf or his people from destruction. And so the world of Beowulf, however noble, is consumed by the values it is based on. It is reduced to ashes by a long history of raids and never ending cycles of revenge. So the poem aims to strike a very delicate balance between the admiration and condemnation for these ancestors. And there is a sense of sadness that this world is built on shaky foundations, on values that, because they are pagan and bloody, cannot last. Finally, since it has all these monsters and dragons and all these fantastical elements, it might seem like Beowulf is a sort of fairy tale, not to be taken seriously. But Beowulf is an intensely political and historical poem. Alongside the main action focused on our hero, we get these glimpses at the war between the Geats and the Swedes, between these tribes, and all the betrayals and attempts at peace that always fail. So Beowulf's mythical elements can be seen as commentaries on the social order and cultural practices in the heroic world of the poet. Grendel's mother can be, for example, interpreted as representative of the practice of feuding, which is another way of saying revenge, the duty of revenge for the killing of a relative, and thus for the world of the tribe, based on family ties and the duty to avenge your relatives. Because Beowulf also shows us a clash of two opposing cultures: the male world of the warrior band gathered in the hall around their king on the one hand, and that of the tribe, organized around agriculture and family ties and the duty for revenge on the other hand. And think about this world in which there is no law, there is no police. If one in your family died, it was the duty of the family to take revenge on the killer or on his family. And this duty is the unwritten law that keeps society together, and it is what stops people from killing each other without any fear of punishment. Because, of course, the punishment is in this case enacted by the people directly involved in such acts, your family. Now, when the heroic culture comes along, and it is what these early states in Europe are based on, they try to replace this king kind of society with one based on obedience to the king. But things don't go so easily because the old ways of clans and tribes being caught up in never ending cycles of revenge prevent the heroic world centered on the king from taking control. And this world of tribal kinship is the world of Grendel and his mother. But the poem asserts the dominance of the warrior band. It celebrates the hero in heroic isolation, fighting for honor and fame rather than family and home. The hero is rewarded with riches by his king, but he is ruthless, unmarried with no children. And you can see this clash also in the human world of the poem, because historical tribes such as the Geats and the Swedes never stopped raiding each other because of this duty for revenge. And on the other hand, the dragon can be seen as a kind of king in reverse, because this is one of the functions of the king in Beowulf and in heroic society. He leads his men in war and they win treasure in these raids, but he has the obligation to distribute, to give away this treasure amongst his warriors. One of the phrases for king in Old English is literally ring giver, bergifa. And so this is the main function of the king. He gathers wealth, but also gives it away to his companions. And so if a king does not do that, if he just gathers wealth for himself, what does this make him? A dragon, because dragons like gold and don't like sharing, and they like to be alone. So, what you have to remember from all this is that these apparently fantastical, mythical elements point to very real concerns in Anglo Saxon society. What makes a good king? What makes a hero? What are the consequences of these cycles of revenge? How and the point is that Beowulf is not simply a superhero, and the poem is not simply a good versus evil story. Is Beowulf a hero? The answer is not simple. But this is precisely why, in many points, the poem is ambiguous. And after this, we'll talk about some of these points and about the things that made you curious, and I'll be happy to answer questions, any questions that you might have. Thank you for listening.